All right, now that we got you all locked in, um, welcome to our short talk here on crowdsourcing programming languages and well-managed use. My name is Steve Husak. I'm a distinguished engineer at Capital One. I've been there for 11 years this month, actually. In that time, I've worked in our credit card space, our commercial banking space, and currently I'm an individual contributor in our open source program office and the area that centers our programming language center of excellence.
Sally Deering, and I've been at Capital One about 14 years, and I program manage our Center of Excellence for our programming languages. And I've been in our card group, our commercial audit, and now in our developer experience team.
So the journey towards well-managed language use at Capital One, it actually started way back when with our open source journey. This journey has been progressed over many years. There's a talk later. I don't see Dwayne here, but he'll be talking around 3:30, I think, on this topic, or 3:45. But the journey, in our case, was part of becoming an open source first company. And all companies that go through this have a typical path towards this journey. Sometimes the use of open source software happens organically. It just starts to spring up. And then after that, the company realizes they need to set up an OSPO or an open source programs office to start to monitor and govern the usage of open source in a responsible manner. And then it leads into training and your developers and your leadership on how to use and deal with open source in the entire ecosystem. So what we've noticed is this then leads to the organic growth of communities within the company. And so there's a natural evolution towards reuse, openness, and for us, this led to the formation of our communities around our open source software, including our programming languages. So what does it mean to have an open source mindset? It means you're going to be working in the open. You're going to be providing a single space for discussions and the decisions that come out of those discussions. You're going to organize for reuse with good documentation, the governance aspects of open source software, and that kind of thing. And Sally will get more into that a bit later. One thing that's very important is that good documentation. I think you've probably heard this, and if you've gone to any talk today on open source or ever, you'll hear documentation, documentation, documentation. It is literally a huge key. And then, then there's the formalization of establishing your pathways for the code discovery, accessibility, and enhancement that goes forward with that. So in our case, communities of practice can help lead the way. So they are a great starting point. So these communities of practice that we're talking about today are around programming languages, but this could spring up around any technology at a company. But in our case, these are our 4 main programming languages. We have many more in use. These are the 4 biggest ones. And these communities sprung up pretty much organically with SMEs and interested parties and people just getting involved of talking about their language and that kind of thing. So this helped start to bring a structure around how we viewed and use our open source software programming languages within Capital One. The COPs in this case usually are optimized for their own use. Meaning that Go COP is going to run a little differently than the Java COP, and the the JavaScript COP or the Python community might run in a different way. So this can be evidenced by the Python community will typically talk about PEPs instead of decisions and that kind of thing. The Go community, in our case, they run pretty much like Go is run out of Google. They're a little bit secretive, and then they'll tell you something that's public. And then the other 2 are just working as they do. So, but the challenge with this is without the intentional connections between the COPs, they optimize locally and not globally. And so they can struggle to gain enterprise-wide leverage. So what we did is we established a center of excellence over top of our COPs. And all this did was provide a way for these COPs to start to communicate up so that the communication could start to go out across the enterprise. As you can see, this is a top-down approach, and it doesn't really solve all of the problem. So to solve all of the problem, you also need them to communicate across one another. And the way that we solved for this was our COE, our Center of Excellence, has core team members that are each participants of each COP. And those core team members are dedicated resources to our Center of Excellence. This is their day job. This is what they do. And then they interface with the individual COPs. Now, COPs are usually more volunteer-based. It's not everybody's day job to promote JavaScript at Capital One. Actually, it's probably my job when I get down to it, but it's not anybody else's. And so it's helpful to have that participation in those groups. They can bring what the COE wants to achieve throughout a year, whether that's an OKR or an initiative or something that needs to be delivered on behalf of the COPs themselves. So, like I said, the communication needs to be omnidirectional. Now, Sally's going to go more into the steps here that we went through along the way.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, so we wanted to share a little bit about the steps we took in establishing the Center of Excellence. I noticed yesterday in the Community Leadership Summit, they did a word cloud about what are one of the big things people wanted to solve for in community leadership, and one of the big ones was getting started, so I thought actually this could really help. So we created a foundation for this COE, who was leading it, what were its responsibilities, and then we marketed it across leadership and our developer base. We have a large developer base. And then we worked on standardization, so there was commonalities across the COPs that we coordinate. And we wanted to ensure collaborative practices along the way, because that was really kind of the whole point. So to get started, we did create a specific brand for the COE. We couldn't show it here because it's internal, but you get the idea. We have a specific name and a logo for it. And a brand is a promise, so we did also create a mission statement that is shown here. We wanted to keep it simple, and it's to promote excellence of the use of the languages that we have and promote community around them across the company. We also defined and documented clear roles and responsibilities between the COE and the different communities of practice. And that's an ongoing, as you might imagine, that's an ongoing thing as we do more and more things. We then took the brand on the internal road. So you can just see the types of groups and forums we engaged with, probably typical at large companies, developers, their managers, senior leadership, architecture, product, anyone who would listen. But just really, in the program project manager in me, is just plan for this. Know it'll take some time. It doesn't take an inordinate amount of time, but it does take time. And it makes a big difference in terms of getting the word out. So our COE, we did also make sure that each language community practice had similar setups. So there, Steve mentioned, there's an overall lead for the COP, for each COP. And then there's a technical lead within each COP that drives initiatives there. And that's all in addition to sort of a dedicated team we have for our Center of Excellence over top. We also, we worked with the COPs to define roles that people could take on. If you've ever volunteered for something, you probably know it's always better to like, how can I help? People have sort of an answer for, here are options and ways to help. We also centralized documentation for all the languages to a single location. And that includes things like which language to pick when, sort of guidance on that, what works best when, how to get involved with the communities, what issues the communities are tackling. And regarding standardization, so we did it where it made sense, but we also wanted to make sure the COPs had a lot of leeway to do what to do what they want to do to innovate. It is actually a pretty strong premise at Capital One is hire good people and then unleash them to do what, to use what they can do. So we didn't want to constrain them with, really rigid standards. And the fourth item was also, I mentioned we work to ensure open practices are used. So we do have just some of those practices are we have active, structured Slack channels, by COP for the COE versus support for the languages. There's a lot of kind of in there on what people do with these languages. We have the structured Slack channel approach in addition to GitHub for communications, and we default to public versus private for communications. And working transparently isn't necessarily natural for people, especially kind of in a large org. So we do monitor it and encourage it. If we see kind of private conversations, we let's bring them public. So we knew things were working when the language communities started growing even more organically. People wanted to get involved. Steve mentioned these COPs did exist, but when we started to put some of this structure and some routines about COPs getting together and more conversation, people wanted to get involved. And they saw it as a place where they could share their passions, they could develop new skills, they could expand their network, in the company. And perhaps most important for a lot of them, it was influencing the tool sets that they need to use within the company to do their jobs. So they knew by being involved in, this is what is sort of manifested, by being involved in the COPs and the COE, we've been able to have more influence on the enterprise tools. People are recognized for their involvement with improving the use of a language at Capital One. And more and more developers, turn to the experts within these communities when they need assistance or they have something they want to improve or they want to kind of become an expert themselves. So success for us includes that we're always using the latest versions of languages and we're minimizing our risk, in using open source. It includes that our language experts are actively sought out, so people can sort of do the right thing. And then we can leverage reuse of code across a large developer base through standardization. And I mentioned that we really are having sort of a material influence on how the enterprise tools grow and innovate now that we sort of have a connected voice of developer. So it's been about a year and a half. We went from siloed language communities of practice to a federated structure with common goals and standards and practices. We went from sort of siloed strategic plans, Steve mentioned sort of localized plans with COPs, to an overall approach to managing the priorities for the languages we use. And we've centralized being able to inform our toolset owners what the most important things are related to the languages that this developer community needs. And all of this actually has been building a case for more dedicated open source language management resources. I think that is all I have.